Promptly after the Second World War in 1945, the Soviet Union had a conniption fit and refused to make amends with the United States and Britain. With Canada's victory against Germany, this war would not end smoothly. Germany was ready to seek revenge and to potentially create a new threat for the rest of the world. This threat came unexpectedly and suddenly for Canada in September 1945. A man named Igor Gouzenko contacted authorities in the newsroom of Ottawa Citizens and had announced there was evidence of a Soviet spy ring. Igor Gouzenko wore a protective mask to hide his identity, which for most Canadians became his trademark. The Soviet spy ring selected people as decoys to collect information through a secretive organization. You would have people who would disguise themselves and create false identities to get any bit of information that they could. Upon this announcement, Canada encountered a rude awakening, and so had the rest of the world, because at that moment, anyone could potentially be under the surveillance of the Soviet Union, although this announcement was kept hidden until 1946, where the information had been leaked publicly, which had led the people of Canada to create strong opinions against the Soviet Union. At this point in time, Canada was obligated to join sides. Since Canada is seated next to the United States and had already traded parts of sovereignty, such as military and political pacts, Canada would join powers with America. Although Canada was normally on the side of the US, Canada's opposing views to the Vietnam War and Canada's relationship with China and Cuba, along with the prime ministership of Pierre Trudeau, had Canada at odds with their southern neighbors. As years passed, international tension began to escalate, and in 1949, the Soviet Union had tested their first atomic bomb. The intimidation of the atomic bomb had led to immense amounts of military spending that year in Canada, and a year later, in 1950, communist North Korea had invaded America, which created further pressure for Canada on military spending. Several people were paranoid of communist expansion taking over the Western world, and the anti-communist investigations had led to destroyed careers and lives. Between the two superpowers, Canada never had the audacity to have a voice in the international relations. But later in the mid-1950s, events began to unfold in the Middle East that gave Canada the opportunity to have a say in the New World. In 1956, Egypt had seized control of the Suez Canal, and soon, Britain, France, and Israel became embroiled in a conflict with Egypt. The world was at the brink of war. Because of this, Canada had joined the UN, where the Canadian Minister of External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, had proposed deployment of an international peacekeeping force to stabilize the situation, while Britain and France withdrew their forces. Because of Pearson's decision to deploy peacekeepers, he was now seen as a hero and had received the Nobel Peace Prize for resolving the conflict in Egypt. During this time of tension, Canada and the US had worked very closely together. In the fall of 1958, the Prime Minister John Diefenbaker had agreed to accept 56 Bomarc missiles from the US and to deploy them in North Bay, Ontario and La Macasa, Quebec, but later on, Canada had discovered that these types of missiles were designed to hold nuclear warheads, and several protesters were against this idea, although Canada had still accepted the missiles on New Year's Eve 1960. This had obviously created a lot of tension, but Pearson had criticized the Americans for their role in the Vietnam War, and at the same time, Canada had also maintained diplomatic and economic ties with Cuba, which was followed up with the Cuban Revolution. Canada had also refused to join the Organization of American States because of the opposing views in their support and tolerance towards the Cold War dictators. Because of this, US-Canadian policies began to drift apart, and Trudeau had later on removed the nuclear weapons from Canada and had formally recognized China, established a personal friendship with Castro, and had eventually decreased the number of Canadian troops stationed at NATO bases in Europe. These decisions that Canada had made had led to the end of the Cold War, and much like the rest of the world, Canada was ecstatic and had withdrawn the Canadian forces from their NATO commitments in Germany. Military spending had been cut, and air raid sirens in Ottawa were removed. Although Canada still participates in NATO, Canada has been given new missions and priorities.